Hello, and thank you for joining us on the Exploring Consciousness podcast. I'm your host, Donna Rebido. To the podcast. All right, okay, here we go. Welcome, Exploring Consciousness podcast listeners. Today we have a unique and special guest, Dr. Eben Alexander. Welcome to the show, Dr. Alexander.
Well, Donna, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be here with you.
Well, it's great to have a fellow NDEer. I've got to tell you, after mine, I was like you. I wanted to explore the world. Who else has had this?
Absolutely. Well, I'll never forget the first time I spoke at the IANS, the International Association of Near-Death Studies meeting, because there you've got a room with 400 or 500 people in it, and more than half of them are experiencers. Whoa, what a resonance I felt. It was just astonishing to me. The beauty of that connection. Of course, I had met other NDEers before that. I knew I'd felt that resonance kind of one-on-one, but being in a whole group of them, it is just an extraordinary, beautiful experience because of the resonance, that comes. And of course, so much of the story we tell cannot be conveyed by words. And yet NDEers, having been there, they have that heart resonance that is just astonishing and beautiful. And I'm sure that's what a lot of non-NDEers feel too. That heart resonance is not limited, to people who've had the experience. It's a beautiful kind of commonality of our shared kind of spiritual nature. But in a room full of experiencers, wow, does it come back at you?
Yeah, and since you traveled around the world and you've been talking to people about these experiences, a lot of my people know about your book, The Proof of Heaven, but you've written The Map of Heaven, and more recently, Living in a Mindful Universe. If you could, do a quick summary, but I'm really interested in what you have to say about science and spirituality and where we are in the cosmos today.
Okay.
Big question.
Well, yes. Well, Map of Heaven was really my attempt. It came out about 2 years after Proof of Heaven. And what I was realizing, after Proof had been completed in terms of the writing, was the commonality of these experiences. I didn't want anyone thinking, oh, Eben Alexander had some exotic experience that nobody else has had. And that's kind of how the lay press was trying to push it. Here's a doctor who's had this extraordinary experience and it changes everything. Well, bottom line is there have been millions of souls who've had these experiences, especially over the last 6 decades since doctors came up with cardiac resuscitation techniques. So the experiences are out there in large numbers and they have tremendous commonalities, as you know. They basically indicate the reality of kind of a spiritual realm and in kind of our ultimate spiritual home. And so I wanted to convey the commonality that many, many people have had these. In fact, most people probably know someone or have in their family someone who's had an NDE. And that's really the purpose of that second book, the Map of Heaven. And also I comment in there a lot about how modern science is completely consistent with this. Many people are under this false impression that conventional science doesn't allow for things like NDEs. Well, I'll tell you what, quantum informed modern scientific study of consciousness not only allows for the reality of the spiritual realm, but in many ways it insists on it. And that's where I think science and spirituality are coming together. But that, of course, brings to mind that third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. That was co-written with my life partner and Karen Newell, who's been extremely important to me as a spiritual mentor. She's the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics, which is a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment that can be a very powerful tool in helping people kind of escape the illusion of self and the sense of here and now and get more into that timeless spiritual realm. And Living in a Mindful Universe, we go a long way towards trying to show how this is all absolutely about the kind of cutting edges of science today, and the acknowledgement of the absolute reality of our spiritual nature. And that, in fact, the scientific revolution is all about the oneness of consciousness. There's not a multiplicity of conscious minds, as people generally think in our culture. but in fact, the science and human experience in general indicates that we have a tremendous amount of overlap. I like to look at, in discussions of the one mind, of that God force at the core of all our conscious awareness, is kind of like a giant diamond. And each and every one of us are simply facets on the diamond, but we all contribute to the evolution of all consciousness through living our lives and coming into a deeper understanding of our relationship with the universe. And that's where living in a mindful universe really goes. It goes to the deep spiritual nature, but it depends very heavily on all of the facets of the modern scientific discussion about the nature of consciousness. We leave far behind that kind of disproven myth that the physical world is all that exists, and that existence is birth to death and nothing more. And really delve deeply into the reality of these spiritual experiences. And that includes not only afterlife stories and after-death communications, deathbed visions and all of that, but past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation. A lot of the work done at University of Virginia over 6 decades by rigorous skeptical scientists trying to understand consciousness, who have identified more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children, where the best explanation is actually of reincarnation. So anyone who today who wants to discuss science and philosophy in terms of the nature of consciousness, if you're not including a robust examination of the literature and understanding in your modeling of the afterlife and of reincarnation, you have no idea what you're talking about. This and even to understand everyday consciousness, me sitting here and kind of looking around and kind of being consciously aware of the environment around me is a deep mystery that science really has not come close to solving until now, as we expand our boundaries of explanation.
When I was at Monroe Institute at Dr. Scott Taylor, who you probably know.
Oh, yes, Scott's a great
guy. I was at, I will say hello. I was at his near-death experience workshop, which he actually asked me to take. He said there are some commonalities you would be interested in. But our guest speaker was PMH Atwater. I recorded her for over an hour talking about all this research. But isn't that true? And she was talking a lot about the kids. How do you discount that?
Well, I know. PMH has done some very good research, and I can highly recommend her books. She has really helped, as some people may know. She had 3 NDEs back in 1977. Bam, bam, bam. And she has just done a world of good to help educate this world about NDEs. When you think about it, her timing, she came in just 2 years after Raymond Moody had written his book, Life After Life, which in many ways for the modern world was the kind of reinitiation of this kind of thinking, even though a lot of this notion of one mind and the deep lessons of NDEs has been part of the perennial philosophy of very thoughtful, sentient beings going back thousands of years. But in many ways, the modern era was initiated by Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, and PMH was there right at the beginning. 2 years later, she had 3 powerful experiences. And you're right, the work she's done, especially with children, I think has been tremendously informative. There are features of NDEs in children that in many ways give us a richer view, or kind of combined with adult stories, they really kind of round out the package and show the power of this kind of understanding and support the reality of the realms that we visit. I think ultimately in this kind of reunion of science and spirituality, that's an important point. Is it really causes us to reflect deeply on the nature of our relationship with the universe and our very purpose for being. That's why I often say that NDEs are not so critical just because they tell us that when we die, we're actually liberated to a much higher consciousness, and that our relationships with loved ones are the reason the whole universe exists. So don't worry about being separated, in any permanent sense from loved ones, just that you've left the physical plane. But it's much more the lessons they offer about how to live these lives. The choices we make every day are greatly kind of enriched and enlivened when we realize this kind of eternity of soul and the importance of our kind of choices in dealing with ourselves and with others, and trying to understand our reason for being in the universe.
Well, you said you listened to my NDE, and at one point I realized I gave up my choice. And I said choice was the most important lesson that I learned on the other side. And once I gave it up, it was the lesson I was to bring back. So that brings home, and I've lived my life since then, like almost moment by moment, realize, like how important each choice is by moment, even how you think. Go
I
ahead.
think that's a crucial point that you're making. And, for those in the audience who may not be aware, although I think most people are aware now, this whole concept of the life review. Life reviews occur in more than 50% of near-death experiences. They've occurred going all the way back at least to the time of Plato, 2,400 years ago, when he wrote about the Armenian soldier Your life flashing before your eyes is a very real part of our existence. And the life review, from my perspective as a scientist, uh, has two really deep and profound lessons to teach us. One is that our boundaries of self are not so strict as we often believe in this world, because in a life review, you often experience it from the emotional perspective of those around you who were impacted by your own actions and thoughts in your lifetime. Um, and so that kind of sense of self, you've got to question those boundaries and realize that we are all truly in this together. And we're truly facets of that gem of the one mind. The other crucial thing that I think life reviews show us is that what we look at as time flow in this universe is really just a stage setting that supports the drama to unfold in our lives. But don't think that time flow in the earthly realm is some ultimate determinant of causal flow and the way history and destiny is evolving in the bigger universe. From that spiritual perspective, there's something I call deep time, which is a whole different kind of higher ordering of causality that involves, for example, the progression of a given soul through their multiple lifetime incarnations. That can be apparent from that realm as evolving over deep time. Likewise, I would say that the whole purpose for existence for the universe is for sentient beings to basically come into a deeper and richer understanding of their relationship with the universe and growing towards that oneness with the divine. And that is something that really cannot happen over one physical lifetime and demands multiple lifetimes. And yet it shows us in many ways that the causal events contribute to the evolution of all consciousness. For that, I would say it was probably 6 months after my coma when I read Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's book, The Phenomenon of Man. And he was a French Jesuit priest. He was a scientist, a paleontologist, and he wrote an extraordinary book in the mid-20th century where he looked at evolution, going far beyond the kind of minuscule view of evolution, of Darwinian evolution, biological systems on Earth. And he realized that, in fact, all of consciousness was evolving. And that's really the bigger picture. And I would say, just like that old saying, all politics is local. Well, all evolution of consciousness throughout the universe is ultimately nothing more than sentient beings coming into a deeper understanding of their relationship with the universe, which is especially apparent when you realize through quantum physics and modern philosophy of mind and neuroscience that the picture emerging about consciousness is one of consciousness being fundamental in the universe, leading to top-down causation that basically governs all the events in our lives. And that is an extraordinary lesson that helps us, again, to appreciate more deeply why going within, exploring mind, when you realize your mind is not created, between your ears and a 3.5-pound gelatinous mass, but that brain is simply working as a filter to allow in an expression of primordial mind, the connected consciousness. That's where we can all grow into a much richer understanding of our meaning and purpose of our existence, and how we can contribute to the higher good.
Oh, I love that idea, and brain as filter and reductionist theory with regard to the brain. And who else would be able to tell us about that but yourself, a neuroscientist who had this powerful, unique NDE. You want to talk a little bit about, I know in the beginning of our podcast where people didn't get to hear, you were starting to talk about the neocortex. And how did your neocortex grow back? How are you alive, Eben? I don't get it.
That's a good question. And, I tried to kind of convey some of that mystery of my recovery in the book Proof of Heaven.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we have the appendices that deal with various hypotheses for how it might have happened from a conventional kind of physicalist perspective. And really, all of those fell away as impossible. They didn't explain it. Now, it turns out that since Proof of Heaven came out, 3 doctors reviewed my medical records. They were fascinated by my recovery. They were not involved in my care, but absolutely amazed that somebody that sick with a severe case of meningitis could end up having a full recovery. And it truly is, from a medical perspective, it's really a true miracle. And for those who want to learn more about the miraculous nature of it, I would steer you to their case report on my medical records. It came out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in September of 2018. It's by Surbi Khanna and others, including Dr. Bruce Grayson. In fact, they had trouble getting that case report published because the peer reviewers said the case was absurd. Somebody this ill from meningitis spending a week in coma, CSF glucose level of 1, and with a Glasgow coma scale that through most of that journey was between 6 and 7. It sometimes, I believe, it dipped as low as 5. Anything below 9 is deep coma. And that's where I was that whole week with a disease that demonstrably had been documented to be affecting all 8 lobes of my brain. So it really, you can not as a physician study that medical record and come away from it going, yep, I've seen that kind of case before. No, it's
Never.
just a mind bender that demands explanation. But in fact, the way that they got the case published, given the fact that the peer reviewers said this can't be a real case, is they said, well, we know of other cases of near-death experiences. For example, Anita Morjani, who wrote the book Dying to Be Me. She had an advanced lymphoma and was down to 85 pounds, deep coma. She should have died within hours of presenting to a Hong Kong emergency room back in February. I think it was
2006, I think, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But she didn't. She made a beautiful recovery. I presented with her many times. She completely healed from her cancer. Beautiful example. Dr. Mary C. Neal is another case. She wrote the book To Heaven and Back, orthopedic surgeon who had a kayaking accident in warm water drowning in southern Chile back in the late 90s, in which she was underwater for more than 30 minutes. And I in fact, when I listened to your NDE, it was just an astonishing kind of revisiting of that extraordinary healing that can happen after a drowning accident like you had. And Mary C. Neal came back to this world, went back into orthopedic surgery and sharing her story. I love how you share your very similar story. I mean, amazing how much healing can happen with the spiritual content of an NDE. And the point I would like to make for your audience is, as a physician, we have honored the power of belief to play a role in healing for at least 6 decades now by using placebo effect as the gold standard for evaluating any new treatment modality. A lot of medications, in fact, certain surgical procedures, you can do a sham procedure and mimic it and do a placebo-controlled study. And if you ask Big Pharma if placebo effect is real, they'll go, oh, it's terrible. It's a 30% hurdle they have to overcome at the outset because of the proven power of people's beliefs to influence their healing in a very positive way. And I think these miraculous healings in near-death experiences are very instructive because they show us kind of a very high end of capability of our spiritual essence. Once we're aware of that, kind of accept that, especially if we've spent a life in kind of prayer and meditation and getting to know our spiritual side, we have a lot better ability for that mind over matter or spirit over matter ability to become more whole. That's essentially what it's doing.
I love that. I want to kind of switch a little bit because the importance of sound and vibration. I'm from Western New York, which we knew about Nicholas Tesla because of the power plant at Niagara Falls. So I grew up knowing about this man, and I thought everybody did. So he talked about everything is vibration, frequency, energy, and energy carrying information. And in my searching for people who were like me, I found your Sacred Acoustics. And going into the Foundation Series 2, Ohm and Portal, can bring me back to that experience. How can people who haven't had a near-death experience benefit from sound in sound recordings?
Beautiful question. I'd like to open by another quote from Nikola Tesla, because I greatly respect him too as a scientist and engineer. In fact, our modern electrified world in many ways is thanks to Tesla and his brilliant mind and understanding. And there's a quote from him, I believe we have it in our book, Living in the Mindful Universe. And he said, when science begins to investigate non-physical phenomena, they will discover more in their first decade than in all their previous history. He was absolutely on to something very deep because of his acknowledgement of the reality of kind of the spiritual realm that's revealed through NDEs and many other similar kind of explorations. And you ask a beautiful question about sacred acoustics, binaural beat brainwave entrainment. How can that help anybody kind of get there and get to a deeper understanding? I've been using sacred acoustics type sounds for more than 10 years in my own kind of practice of going within. I try and meditate an hour to a day using sacred acoustics. And I can kind of cut to the chase a bit. I would kind of remind people that there is, for example, there's a lot of healing now that's being associated with the use of psilocybin and magic mushrooms to basically kind of, from my point of view, it's not the psychedelic that's actually leading to the healing. It's the fact that it thins the veil and enables us to connect more closely with our kind of higher soul. And that's the kind of work Karen and I have done through sacred acoustics. It turns out, I think you can get a much more powerful effect in terms of traversing the veil through sound. In fact, a book, Christopher Bates, B-A-C-H-E, wrote a book called Dark Night, Early Dawn about 15 years ago. In that book, he compared his own efforts using high-dose LSD for spiritual investigation versus his own personal use of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. And what he concluded in that book is, with a dedicated program of pursuit, you can make as much progress with the sound in deep spiritual truth as you can with high-dose LSD. And I think, especially given the kind of biochemical splash that those chemicals leave in the brain, it's a lot safer to pursue the route that he attests is get you easily as far, if not farther. And the thing I would add to that in this discussion is that there are a number of papers recently about psychedelic substances and how they work on the brain. And the universal finding is they work by darkening the brain. Brain activity goes down with these substances. That's something, if you want to learn more, go to my EbenAlexander.com website, go to the reading list, and you'll find several papers about all that. But with LSD, DMT, which is the active principle in ayahuasca, psilocybin, it's been shown the brain is turned off. There's no part of the brain that has an increase in activity. And so that's all just kind of a superficial cortical effect of those plant medicines on the neocortex. And when you think about it, binaural beats are having an effect down in the lower brainstem, way down in a circuit that arose more than 300 million years ago. There's a general principle in evolutionary biology that if you want to understand much more about a certain function, like, for example, consciousness, what you do is look at kind of the evolutionary biology and anatomy of the structure that's associated with it. In this case, that would be the brain. And what you find is, if we're intersecting with a circuit that arose more than 300 million years ago, and it turns out anatomically to be in the lower brainstem, where modern conventional neuroscience would say is kind of the binding engine that sends now signals up 40 times per second to kind of modulate the interaction of the neocortex, the human part of the brain, the main calculator, that basically is involved in everything we see, hear, smell, remember, sense, executive function, body movement, perception of orientation in space. Every bit of that involves the neocortex as the main calculator. And yet it's all coordinated because you can modulate from the lower brainstem those thalamocortical loops. The point I'm making here is I believe sacred acoustics and similar binaural beat brainwave entrainment have so much power because they get at that rich source of modulation of that now signal and allow your conscious awareness to be set free from kind of the machinations of the brain and the body and the kind of here and now of the physical self. And that's where I believe in the workshops that we've done for thousands of people around the world, all of that, we've seen tremendous evidence, plus a lot of what Karen hears back from her users around the world through Sacred Acoustics. And I would encourage people to go to sacredacoustics.com, look at the testimonials page there, also look at her How to Do It page, a series of free videos. They give a lot of clues for how to do this, because ultimately in meditation, what we're trying to do is put that little voice of the ego mind, the little linguistic part of the brain, the voice in our head, that Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, calls your annoying roommate. That's true. That's what it is. That is not your consciousness. Your consciousness is what is aware of that voice. And that's where you can start richly exploring the kind of fundamental neutral observer aspects of that consciousness and traversing the veil of the one mind, getting to the one mind, all through these kind of techniques of meditation where you put that little linguistic running stream of thoughts in the head into time out and start exploring your much richer kind of observer self and its connections across the veil to the one mind.
So, Eben, in this Exploring Consciousness podcast, we've explored the iAwake technology, and I've had Garrett Stevens on with the HemiSync. I'm going to ask Karen to do a podcast with me of just sacred acoustics. So I think you just gave the Wednesday podcast for Karen.
That is a brilliant idea.
Isn't that?
Because,
yeah.
I mean, not only is she the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics and the co-author of my third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, but I was very attracted to her back in November 2011 when we first met, because I sensed this rich spiritual, an age-long kind of soul cooperation in many ways. And that's why I love doing this work with her. In many ways, she's been a profound spiritual mentor to me and helped me to come to a much deeper understanding of my own NDE and how in many ways that heart consciousness, that infinitely loving awareness that I first encountered in my NDE is something any of us can cultivate. Karen's never had an NDE, and yet she has a very rich, profound kind of emanation of that beautiful kind of heart consciousness and sense of connection. So I think that podcast will be one well worth listening to.
Excellent. And as an explorer of consciousness, I explored the Lucia light phenomenon, and I explored ayahuasca. And mostly I go back to sound, and I didn't know the explanation.
Sound is absolutely. I think it's one of the most fundamental ways to help us kind of break free of the illusion of self and of the here and now. We've had many people in our workshops and also people just users of Sacred Acoustics report extraordinary kind of visions and journeys. And it just shows me how you don't have to have an NDE to know all this. As a sentient being, as a conscious human being, you have access to all the tools you need to explore richly and deeply into that kind of primordial awareness of consciousness of the universe and help answer your own questions. Personal experience is ultimately the best tool to any of this kind of knowledge. You can read all the books you want, watch the DVDs, go to the talks, discuss it with people, but ultimately, it really depends on your own personal explorations.
So, Eben, it kind of brings forward what is next in terms of we seem to have an awakening on the planet. And like you said, how many people have had these experiences and how they want to re-experience that, and they can through sound. What are your thoughts on the awakening of the planet? And do you think more the more and more we talk about this, the more and more people, they're going to go to your website, they're going to go to Sacred Acoustics. How is that having an effect in terms of the planet and cosmic consciousness?
Well, I think there's a tremendous revolution going on in the scientific community over the science of consciousness. And this involves not just neuroscience, which involves what's known as the hard problem of consciousness, first put forward by David Chalmers in the mid-1990s. He's an Australian philosopher, but that had been building for decades on a lot of evidence. Wilder Penfield, the renowned Canadian neurosurgeon, had written a book in 1975 called Mystery of the Mind. He was better positioned than probably anybody on earth to comment on the mind-brain connection because of all of his work electrically stimulating the brain in awake patients. And in his book, he makes it crystal clear. Do not expect to explain mind and consciousness based on the workings of the brain alone. There's much more involved. For him, it was very exciting because it awakened the truth of spirituality in a scientific sense. And I would say the evidence has just been accumulating ever since then. A lot of it we talk about in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, in terms of the history of that growth. Quantum physics is a tremendous part of this extraordinary kind of demonstration through the fact that the experiments in quantum physics have progressively put us into a position where objective idealism is the best explanation. And that objective idealism simply points out that ultimately causality in this universe is mental in character. There's a top-down causality that governs all the unfolding that we see. And in quantum experiments, there's a certain group of physicists who would rather not invoke consciousness, but to do so and to explain the findings of the measurement paradox in quantum physics, for example, they have to invoke infinite parallel universes. Hugh Everett's 1957 Many Worlds interpretation of the measurement paradox. For them, infinite parallel universes unfolding at every choice point in time of a sentient observer, yes or no to what they observe leads to a new universe. And this infinite conflagration of parallel universes is very satisfying to them. Well, I think to most of us that makes no sense because it doesn't seem to fit reality. But you can make all of this work and in a perfectly consistent form with quantum physics if you simply look at mind as fundamental and as causal in all of what we see emerging in the universe. Of course, there are physical laws, and the physical laws have a lot to do with kind of that higher consciousness, that one mind in its own way represents the physical laws of the universe. But so much else that involves choices of sentient beings points out the reality of invoking consciousness as fundamental. And that's why that filter theory is so important, because in the modern scientific world, that allows for this primordial mind and this kind of top-down causality of objective idealism to be very real. And it supports NDEs, shared death experiences, supports the reality of reincarnation. Every bit of it, looking at the brain as a filter, makes tremendous sense. And it's filter theory is not a new idea. It came from at least the late 1800s with the work of F.C.S. Schiller, with William James, who was a psychologist at Harvard. And then, of course, in the early 20th century, Henri Bergson in France and Aldous Huxley, who experimented with mescaline and wrote Doors of Perception. He was also a big proponent of filter theory, of this notion of kind of oneness of consciousness, but that the brain served as a filtering mechanism. And of course, in NDEs, that kind of overlap of conscious awareness becomes very clear. The Life Review and other kind of examples of what people experience in an NDE, like kind of sensing consciousness of other beings in the physical world, like Anita Morjani's kind of in her NDE, seeing her brother flying from India to Hong Kong to be with her, or Jeff Olson in his beautiful NDE stories, reporting how when he was in the depths after this traumatic car accident, he was actually experiencing the thoughts of many of the people in the hospital, even perfect strangers. He would kind of overlap with their conscious awareness. Telepathy has been something that from a scientific viewpoint is quite well substantiated as being a real effect. But this kind of non-local consciousness and the science expanding around parapsychological phenomena, demonstrating the reality of telepathy, of remote viewing, of out-of-body experiences, of precognition, presentiment, psychokinesis, distant healing, and then you extend that up into NDEs, shared death experiences, which are just like near death, but they happen in people who are generally healthy. And then, of course, the reincarnation literature. All of that is the scientific body of evidence of modern consciousness studies that insist on a much bigger model of understanding.
Boy, you hit on all the things I'm researching. Every single one you've checked
Excellent.
off. And it's
We are
like
in harmony.
we are. It's like Tom Campbell's big theory of everything. Two fundamental things fundamental to this world is consciousness and evolution. Aldous Huxley, I'm reading The Distilled Spirits by Don Lattin, who talks about Aldous and Bill Wilson and Gerald Hurd coming together. And then I'm a remote viewer. So it's like bringing
Wow, it all comes together. That's why the more we know
does.
about all of this, the
Yes.
more sense it makes. I mean, if you only study one piece of it,
Yeah.
like NDEs only will never, ever answer the question, what happens when you die? Because those people didn't die. But they certainly should give us great food for thought about what does happen when you die, when you combine it with all this other evidence, with all that parapsychological evidence for non-local consciousness, with quantum physics, with human experiences of reincarnation, after-death communications. Every bit of that just shows us a much bigger universe than I used to think, fit the bill before my coma, when I was a conventional card-toting neuroscientist who believed physicalism or materialism was the correct answer. I wanted to believe what I'd been taught in the Methodist Church growing up, but I really couldn't make sense of how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. Now I know absolutely, of course it does. And that's what these books like Living in the Mindful Universe are all about.
Well, when I read your proof of heaven, what struck me the most, and I had read it after my NDE, was your change in worldview. It was very similar to my change in worldview, because you cannot have these experiences and even begin to assimilate what you were taught. What are your thoughts on your change in your worldview, Eben?
Well, I think that's what we're all up to here. And the interesting thing is that a lot of people kind of out in the public who aren't necessarily following the scientific discussion seem to kind of know this and accept this. And in many ways, it's because they've had their own experience. I mean, one of the most common ways that people in our culture come to know the reality of kind of the spiritual realms and the grander universe is through after-death communications. I know a good friend of ours, Dr. Bill Guggenheim, and his former wife, Judy Guggenheim, wrote a beautiful book called Hello from Heaven back in the mid-1990s. To me, that is still one of the best resources on after-death communications. But a lot of people kind of sense this, and they realize that, the scientific community that has tended to, at least conventionally, kind of poo-poo these ideas. Oh, NDEs, forget it. That's nonsense. Can't happen. Well, they haven't had one. And they don't realize that there's a tremendous scientific literature on those people who've had. And not only that, but there are many scientists around the world who are working on this kind of shift of worldviews. For your listeners, if they want to know more about that, I would send them to GalileoCommission.org. That's a group. I'm one of more than 100 scientific advisors to that group. And there's a manifesto presented at GalileoCommission.org. It'll help everybody get onto the scientific advances going on now. And other resources that I think are very, very good about all of this. One is UVADOPS.org. That's University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies for scientific study of near-death experiences, reincarnation, etc. And also noetic.org, the website, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Dean Radin is a very respected scientific investigator who does very rich and deep work investigating the science behind all of this, non-local consciousness, and supporting the reality of that primordial mind and how it manifests in this world. So those are excellent resources. Of course, EbenAlexander.com, SacredAcoustics.com. These are all Sacred Acoustics is very good for the meditative aspects, and for people who want to do their own journeying. EbenAlexander.com has my blog postings, a lot of media appearances, video links. That reading list I talked about, there's a tremendous wealth of information there. to help people get what they need.
You know, it also, one of the ways that I got started on the journey was Dean Radin's Explore magazine,
Yes,
where that's how I met Bill Bankston. And
yes.
Bill
Livingston,
Bankston,
Dr. Larry Dossey, that whole group of
that whole group
scientists.
was how I got started. I actually hosted Bill Bankston out at my college I was teaching at. And what's interesting to me is the pushback of all these scientists. Supposedly, they're the most unscientific group of people that I know. They don't realize how much faith and belief is in their thinking. Would you?
Absolutely. Well, that's a beautiful point. And it turns out that, I mean, realistically, once a scientist starts to study the scientific data we're talking about that supports all this, they leave that conventional, physicalist viewpoint behind because it's clearly false. The brain does not produce consciousness. There's something much richer going on here to explain human experience. And a big part of it is really coming to question everything we've ever assumed to be true. And that includes kind of our observations of existing in this physical world. I mean, the physical world seems to be very real as it is, but the thing they miss, and the scientists miss, is they take it at face value that you're observing an exterior reality, physical reality. And yet, one of the deepest and most profound messages from quantum physics today is that there is no objective physical reality independent of the observing mind. That's the critical part to state. And the more the quantum physics and understanding of it is combined. And for another example, or the pathway I'd like to suggest to people who are especially interested in the quantum physics angle of all this is simply become familiar with Carlo Rovelli's work on what's called the relational interpretation of the measurement paradox in quantum physics. That's really where this whole notion of our mental influence in questioning the universe and performing quantum experiments, et cetera, is kind of acknowledging that mental, what's called contextuality, that the mind of the observer and the choices made of how to do an experiment actually figure very deeply into the behavior of the physical universe underlying it. And that's where you find that work of Carlo Rovelli and the relational interpretation, which is a very bare bones interpretation of the measurement paradox, um, is very helpful. And then follow that with Bernardo Kastrup's metaphysics. If you go to bernardokastrup.com, you'll find he's written extensively on this. He's one of the big endorsers of our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, because we take a multidisciplinary approach to support objective idealism. Bernardo does it in a very kind of clever, conceptual way. As an experienced physicist, computer scientist, he helps to usher in kind of a beautiful interpretation of Carlo Rovelli's work to help you realize very clearly that linkage of quantum physics and how it supports this notion of primacy of mind in a way that I think supplements the way we do it in Living in a Mindful Universe, is part of the scientific revolution. And we hear from a lot of scientists and engineers who are very grateful for this kind of expanded worldview that we're offering, because to them it makes a lot of sense. And this is where I think all of us are getting on board with this scientific revolution that ultimately will make the world a far kinder and gentler place, because it shows the reality of life reviews and how we're really all in this together. And the highest lesson we can learn in living our lives is how to treat ourselves and others with the respect and dignity of the sacred and divine and creative sentient beings that we truly are. It really is inevitable. And this is good news for us. I would say that in many ways, when I look back over the last few centuries of human development, I would say we had a divorce in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a divorce between our scientific, intellectual, technological capabilities and the human spirit. And a lot of that was through the false assumptions of physicalist or materialist science, pretending the brain creates consciousness, all that exists is the physical world, and trying to proceed along that line of inquiry. Well, the chemists committed their sins in World War I, developing machine guns, high explosives, and poisonous gases. The physicists committed their sins in World War II, developing atomic weapons. I promise you, if we're ever stupid enough to have a World War III, that World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. And the important point is that divorce between our scientific capabilities and our human spirit of connectedness, of oneness, of love, kindness, and compassion, we need to annul that divorce. And that's what I believe the current shift in worldviews is doing, is allowing us to recombine our kind of natural spiritual nature with that intellectual and technological capability to redirect it in a far more favorable direction. We like to call ourselves Homo sapiens. You know, sapiens means wise. Well, when I look at our world, yes, I see benefits of science and technology with modern medicine, with transportation, communications. I mean, all these advances, the internet, et cetera, all thanks to science and technological development. But I also see the addiction to fossil fuels, the fact that a million species are threatened with extinction due to that climate change and this horrible fossil fuel addiction that's killing the planet, with that gyre of floating plastic in the Eastern Pacific, twice as big as the state of Texas, and animals choking by the millions dying from that plastic. It's horrific. And it's time for us to take responsibility as stewards for this planet and do a much better job. Sustainable energy, get completely eradicate our addiction to fossil fuels, and let's start taking care of ourselves and this planet for future generations, especially if you need a selfish reason for no other reason than all the scientific evidence supporting reincarnation. We're going to be the ones here suffering from it. So let's go on and do the right thing. I actually prefer thinking of helping our children and grandchildren and doing the best thing for them. But for those of you who are kind of a selfish mode, because of reincarnation evidence, we're all going to be back here again. Let's make sure that planet is sustainable and healthy and beautiful as it was gifted to us.
Amen, brother. Wow. It made me think that in the scientific revolution, and I would teach this in my psychology class, I would teach about the power of the word of Rene Descartes. I think, therefore, I am. I think we can fast forward to 2021 into this era to say, I think, therefore, I love.
I love that. That is absolutely a great translation. And I would say, in reflecting back on Rene Descartes when he said that, he made one little mistake, or people interpret a mistake in that statement. And that is, he said, I think, therefore I am. What he meant was, I am aware of my thoughts and my thinking, and that awareness means I am. It's not the thoughts that made him be, it was his awareness of them. And that's what we talk about in deep meditation, about separating from this kind of ego mind, is more carefully refining what Descartes was actually saying there, what he should have been saying. But I love your interpretation. It's far more pertinent and to the fact of today, with the near-death experiences being kind of the tip of the spear and awakening us to the true nature of consciousness. And at the very heart of that, of course, as any NDEer will tell you, is that binding force of love. I think, therefore, I love.
You know, and it's not only a scientific revolution. I think it's a feeling revolution. It's breaking men away from their stoicism. I love that you shared how you cried when you knew it was your sister. That so touched me. I see more and more of men in my life not being afraid. It's almost like making men fearless again.
I think it is. And what it does, I know Karen educated me years ago about the masculine and feminine energy within us all. And of course, when you realize your soul doesn't have a gender, it doesn't have a skin color, your soul in these incarnations or whatever is necessary to present the particular challenges that will give us the most growth. But her acknowledgement of understanding that masculine and feminine energy balance, to me, has been very instructive. And I think there's not a man on earth that doesn't become much stronger by getting much in touch with their feminine side and their kind of the feminine attributes. And likewise, the masculine attributes also bring something to women. So it's the balance, and that's what allows us to truly kind of come into the souls we are, because our souls ultimately do not have to identify with a given gender because they've lived both, and they've done it in a sense of balance, in terms of investigation, in terms of learning, and much of that lesson, of course, is about our kind of how we all contribute to this growth of consciousness, evolution of consciousness itself. And when we become much more aware of the wholeness within us, we live in a world where we express all these dualities: good, bad, dark, light, evil, what have you, all the different polarities, masculine and feminine. But in those spiritual realms, all of that seems to converge in many ways. And that kind of infinite knowing of the deep spiritual journey of an NDE often involves a resolution of all paradoxes. I often describe that core realm that I visited, the sanctum sanctorum of the divine, where the entire multiverse had been collapsed down into a small oversphere as part of the lessons I was to learn, embedded within all of eternity. It was a dazzling darkness. All paradox comes together into oneness of masculine, feminine, etc. Every bit of it is unified there. That's where our higher soul actually gleans these kind of deep lessons of oneness and of sense of purpose with the universe, is through that kind of an understanding of a resolution of all those opposites and paradoxes. That's where a tremendous amount of knowledge comes from. And that's where exploring within consciousness can be so powerful for all of us.
Well, I want to talk to you about it for another couple of days. We have so much to discuss.
I love this. This is the life Karen and I lead. We just have these discussions every day, and just back and forth, and trying to refine it and understand it. It's great to have a partner who can engage in that kind of beautiful kind of repartee, because you make more and more progress doing it that way.
Thank you, Eben, for being on this podcast.
Thank you, Donna. It's a real joy talking with you. Always share that heart connection with a fellow experiencer, but of course we all share those heart connections with all of our fellow sentient beings. But that beautiful resonance of someone else who's been there and felt that and basked in that love is always a joy. So thank you for having me on.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. We publish our Exploring Consciousness podcast on the Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of the second week of every month. Please check the podcast schedule and more on our companion website, exploreconsciousness.com. Thank you again for listening.